Has anyone ever used a modem or dial-up modem? And probably if you're under 30 and you're saying yes, you've got really cheap parents. Um, because modems haven't been used in a really long time. um, I did. Yeah, because I'm not sure. Anyway, a long time ago. So, and you're over 30. So okay. All right. Your father's probably laughing too. Okay. Well, anyway, That's how the signals work. Um, it's a digital signal, and the zeros and ones we represented this way. So, for example, there would be a down part here, and then that, and then there might be a really long one and a down, and really long and then a down. And what you've got here is you've got a one. The high point represents a one. It's on. The low point represents a zero. So you can imagine that if you were to send the letter A as a digital signal, what it would look like. You'd have a bunch of low points. Well, you'd have a high point. You'd have something like a high point, and then there's a bunch of zeros, so it would go straight across. That's not a wave. That's just my bad art. Then you have another high signal for 64, and then another low. So the letter A being sent as a digital signal might look something like this. That would be the letter A over your communications. Okay, that's a basic introduction to binary. We're going to get into it a little bit more. This is the first class. I don't want to go too far, and I'm going to try and get us done by 7. Um, I'm just going to go through this first chapter real quick. This is not really something you need to worry about too much. It goes through a very basic history of computers in general. So we'll kind of go through it fairly quickly. You can look at it your own. Nothing really technical in here anyway. It's more historical about the history of computers in general. It's kind of an interesting thing to go through. Well, it's got quite a few pages there. Well, we'll go through it fast. Any other questions before we go to this? Is there a chart where we can answer these? Oh, a chat. Um, well, we have the chat here on the webinar. There is a chat that can be set up, or a like a blog that can be set up on web access. And once I get that set up, you'll be able to go there and do that. Um, you're not going to need it for a while. I mean, if you go on Amazon, I'm sure you'll get it within a week, and that's plenty. Okay, so talking about computers, and again, this basically goes through a background. A lot of I've already said. We're going to be concentrating on HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript for the most part. We'll talk a little bit about object technology, but we don't have to get into that a lot. A lot of you'll be able to get from my website because I have a lot of material on my website. Others, I mean, quite frankly, you can probably just Google it. I hate to say that, but it's normally what I do. Um, but the book will definitely be helpful as well. Again, we're going to talk about HTML5 mostly, CSS3, and JavaScript. We'll go into some of the newer technologies for HTML5 like Canvas and a very popular JavaScript library that I like a lot, jQuery. And we'll go through, throughout the semester, we'll go through the multi-tier application architecture. I already showed you that slide earlier was essentially the architecture that was very high level. We'll get into it in more detail as well. Client-side scripting is JavaScript. Mention the Worldwide Consortium. It's supported by all the big players in the internet, including Microsoft, Apple, Oracle, Google, Mozilla. I'm trying to think who else. There's probably a few. IBM, I think, is on it as well. And they collectively established the standards for HTML. Oops, sorry. Um, I wouldn't worry so much. The internet is agnostic to operating systems, so we don't have to worry about it. The main thing with mobile devices is that you have to design the interface differently for mobile devices because you've got a smaller space. We'll go through a few programming languages, starting with JavaScript and then probably PHP. The internet, we're going to be concentrating on the client side. We will get into server side, but we're going to concentrate on client side, which I kind of talked about a little bit already when I showed you that architecture. Read through the book. There's some websites that you can look at for support as well. Dytel's website. If you don't have multiple browsers installed, I suggest you do it, particularly for HTML5 because Microsoft browser doesn't fully implement it yet. Google fully implements it. So if you're not a Chrome user, you might want to consider that. I have everyone muted, so you can only hear me. If you have a question and you want to speak the question, I can unmute you. But what I found is that most people don't have mics, and so they type the questions. I don't want to unmute everyone because then it'll be crazy. I've done that before, and I didn't get to say a thing, so I need to lecture. But if you prefer to say something over the mic, I could do that. Smartphones and tablets. I've written some HTML5 apps for iPhones, iPads, and any type of phone, and they work really well. Both Apple and on the iPhone and Google on the Androids have fully implemented HTML5 on their browsers. So Safari, actually in general, is another good one because it fully implements HTML5. Is there a group chat room? I'm going to set one up on web access. I think Chrome actually better implements the HTML standard than Firefox. I really like Firefox as a developer. I think their debugging tools are better than Chrome. But for the actual HTML5 standard, Chrome seems to be a little bit better. Yes, do people not know how to log into web access? You go to I'll show you the website before the class ends. Moore's Law, I think everyone heard Moore's Law. He's one of the founders of Intel. Says that every 2 years the capability of computers doubles. The most interesting thing about that is that by 2032, that means computers are going to be smarter than us. That's the scary thing. If that rule continues, by 2032, computers will be programming us, not us programming them. There's some examples of projects. I work in healthcare, and healthcare IT is a big thing, and we're doing a lot of stuff with HTML5 for healthcare and electronic health records. So I'm not really sure why they're going through this. I think it's a good examples. There's some special rules that have to deal with healthcare data and sending it over the internet. There's a law called HIPAA that has to be very strictly followed. Talk a little bit about security as we go on as well. The history of computers. There'll be some more examples. Amber Alerts. Just examples of stuff that's used for social good. And there's a lot of activism on the internet now. Obviously, the internet has literally made everyone an author and everyone an activist. And for the most part, for the better. I mean, the internet has, forced some companies to change policies and governments to change policies for the better. So that's not a bad thing. There are lots of examples of using it. Cloud computing is the next big thing. I don't really think cloud compute. It's kind of funny. We're talking about hosting, right? Hosting. Some company hosting a server for you. Back many years ago, I think it was called time sharing or something, and where you kind of logged onto a computer that was at some server site and you used it and you paid so much for it. And then, as the internet became popular, that was called ISP, internet service provider, and you can put a website on that, and people can go look it up and everything like that. And now they're called cloud computing, which is basically the same sort of idea, hosted computing, but instead of hosting your server, they're basically hosting your desktop. So your desktop computer becomes a virtual desktop, and you can run all kinds of cool applications off of them. Well, you can kind of do that right now. The idea of cloud computing is something like Google Apps. You can use a Google word processor completely online, and a Google spreadsheet completely online and completely through HTML. It's an idea of cloud computing, and it's really just it's not something that's really new or amazing. It's something that's built on hosting, and hosting has been around for decades. So, of course, calling it cloud computing gives it some sort of marketing, pizzazz to it or something, but it's really just what we've been calling hosting for decades. Global positioning satellite. You can now go into the restaurant and click one button on your iPhone, and everyone knows that you're having dinner at Chili's. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but everyone on Facebook and Foursquare knows that you're at Chili's having dinner. Not sure that's a good thing, but anyway, you can do that. Robots. And I've done some robot programming in Java. Very cool. Obviously, NASA has put rovers on the moon, on Mars. Excuse me, everyone knows that. And I believe they now have a site there that will allow you, I don't know if they'll let you do it, but they'll let you control a robot remotely. Robots are cool things. I've done some robotic programming, and usually the first Java class they actually include some robotics programming. Email, everyone knows email, messaging, video chat, and FTP. Of course, all the other stuff, the newest stuff with the iTunes and game. You can play games online all the time. I know people that play games online all the time. They're kind of addicted to it. They never stop playing games. Okay, so we're going to look at HTML5, which generically includes CSS3, JavaScript, Canvas. jQuery is actually a separate library. It's not part of HTML5. There used to be a stricter version of HTML called XHTML. It's kind of been dropped. The old standard, I think, was called XHTML4 or something. The X has been dropped. It was kind of the idea of a stricter version of it through a language called XML, which is not as popular as it used to be. I believe the official standard actually uses XHTML, strict typing. And what the strict typing on XML basically says things like you have to do your open and close tags have to match, and they have to be of the same case. Whereas original HTML would let you use any mix of upper and lower case, and if you forgot a close tag, it would just take care of it for you. Eric, you're having trouble with your audio. Can anyone else not hear me? Is anyone having trouble hearing me, or can you hear me? Looks like one student's having trouble hearing me. It's choppy. Okay, I'll try and oh, cutting out. I'm sorry. I'll try and lean closer to the computer. Is it any better now? Okay, I was kind of leaning away from the computer. Maybe that's. The connection could be a little slow. All right. Right now, where you're typing the responses during the webinar is fine. When you're doing lab assignments, you just upload the lab to WebAccess. And I'll go over WebAccess before we leave. Cascading style sheets is also part of the standard, and it has to do with setting global
styles. So, for example, if you say that you want your titles to always be in navy blue, you can set a cascading style sheet that says titles will be navy blue, and then then all titles after that will be navy blue. Am I still cutting out, people? It's probably the connection. I don't think it's my microphone because I normally don't have problems with people hearing me. We're not going to go too much longer. Oh, it's better now? Okay. Okay, so that's cascading style sheets. They set global things, and we're going to go through CSS in much more detail. This is just very quickly what it is. Sounds better? Okay. JavaScript is a scripting programming language that we will go through. It was created by Netscape. It wasn't originally called JavaScript, but through a marketing deal with Sun, Netscape agreed to call it JavaScript and also to try and be consistent in adding functionality to the programming languages so that Java and JavaScript would more or less match. Now, Java and JavaScript look and like very similar languages, and in many regards exactly the same language, but they're not really the same language. They're both based on the C programming language and the C++ programming language, and that's why they look alike. And then because of this marketing agreement, both companies kept the languages more or less the same for years. Now, Netscape's gone, but it went on this way for so many years that they're very similar languages now. JavaScript, eventually first Microsoft came out with its own scripting language called VB Script. The problem was that at that time, they didn't have much market share with IE, and Netscape refused to have any sort of VB Script in its browser, so they were forced to go with JavaScript. And by the time they got the market share they needed to drive the standard, there were so many websites using JavaScript, there's no way they could have just told people to switch to VB Script. So JavaScript survived, and now with so many other players in it, it's going to be there. It is the only scripting language on the browser. It's basically based on a European standard called ECMAScript, European Computer Manufacturers Association. But ECMAScript was based on, again, the C and C++ languages. What is a scripting programming language? If you've never seen one, I don't know if you've ever seen a programming language. A programming language is essentially you give instructions to the computer and what to do in a very detailed way. You'll see examples of scripting. We can't show you everything tonight, so I wouldn't worry too much about it, but we certainly will be able to show you languages as well, eventually. Web browsers and web browser portability. They used to be really good, but the advent of HTML5 and the rush, particularly by Apple and Google, to get HTML5 in their browsers has opened up inconsistencies again. Eventually, those inconsistencies will go away because Microsoft wants to get their browsers HTML5 compliant as quick as they can as well, because they're going to get hurt on mobile market share. Not that they have much right now, and that's obviously market share they want to grow. So that really encourages Microsoft to get HTML5 compliant as quickly as possible. Many different versions. You can get them for every operating system. I have a Mac, Windows computer, and a Linux computer, and I have Chrome and Firefox on all of them. Chrome and Firefox seem to work on all of them. Microsoft IE will only work on Windows, obviously. Apple will work on Windows or Mac, but they do not have a Linux version. I tend to like Google the best. Although, I used to like Firefox the best, but I'm kind of definitely strongly leaning towards Google now. You have to be careful. The vendors are trying to be compliant. They realize they have to, but it's never 100%. So, market share as of a year and a half ago, Google was doing pretty good. 17% market share. Firefox, 27% market share. Safari, 7%. Opera, 2%. And Internet Explorer, 40%. So, gone are the days when Microsoft had 95% market share. That's gone. On the mobile market, actually, Android beats the iPhone, 18% to 15%. Actually, there are more Android phones out there than there are iPhone phones out there. It's just that the iPhone comes from only one vendor, and Android comes from a half dozen vendors. So Apple has the largest single market share, but the Android is actually the largest operating system on mobile devices. Support, it's growing. There's a website there that can help you test your stuff. Just using Google Chrome will help as well. You should definitely always test all your stuff. The other thing we're going to have to talk about, which is becoming really important, is the concept of ADA compliance, which is the American with Disabilities Act. We spent the last 6 months of last year doing almost nothing but ADA compliance because we had to be live by the first of the year under various laws and agreements. So that's actually a complex issue, and we need to address it. You need to know about it. If you're actively going to be working and developing web pages, you have to know that there are laws that say if your website is not ADA compliant, you can get sued by individuals or by the government. So pretty serious stuff. jQuery is a library that we'll learn about when we get into JavaScript. I won't bother talking about it now. It's a really cool library if you're doing a lot of JavaScript programming. You have to use proper HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You have to do this even though the browsers will let you cheat. Going back to the ADA compliance thing, not using proper HTML and CSS will get you into an ADA compliance problem. The way it works is that there are things called readers for the blind that will read an HTML pipe and literally speak out what the site says. And the problem is that the site is not properly using proper HTML and CSS. The reader for the blind will make mistakes, and you've got an ADA compliance issue there. So you have to use proper HTML and CSS. And we'll get into what we mean by that. There are some websites that will help you validate that your HTML5, CSS, and your JavaScript are compliant. We'll look at some of those as we go as well. And there's some different websites you can look at. I'm not going to go through each one of them. You can look at them if you want. The Internet. So how many people know that the Internet is... How many people think the Internet is only like 20 years old? Came out in the 90s. Do you think that you're wrong? The Internet actually came out in the late 60s from the Advanced Research Projects Agency. Essentially, that is essentially a department for military research. It was originally called the ARPANET. And the ARPANET was originally created actually for defense purposes, for guaranteeing that the military's communication network would be up no matter what happened, even if half the cities in the countries were nuked. So the ARPANET was created to make sure that even if the Russians nuked half our country, we could still nuke them back. That's kind of ironic, considering all the liberal activism that takes place on the Internet today. It's quite ironic. But it was created originally as a military project, and specifically to control communication centers to make sure they could still... can the U.S. shut down the entire Internet if it wanted to? I don't think so. It would... They could probably block a lot of it. The problem is the Internet is now controlled by many universities. It's controlled largely by universities, communication companies, other countries. I don't think they could shut down the whole thing unless they got some sort of crazy technology that I don't know about. They could certainly, control a lot of it within our country's borders. Yeah, they could if they wanted to. I don't think they'd get away with it. But I don't think they could shut down the whole internet. The U.S. government still has an awful lot of say of what happens in the internet, including overseas, because they created it for starters. Not alone, by the way. There were an organization in Europe called CERN, which helped with it. The U.S. military build the internet.